lots of people popping in. Some of them I know. You don't work for JGA, Sue. You work for Genius Within.
I know, but I'm their account manager.
Biddy, it's nice to meet you. I've heard so many things about you. All good from Sue, can I just say. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Lunch and Learn with Genius Within on the subject of neurodiversity. I am going to do the kind of working through the information, but you've also got Royston on this call and Sue from Genius Within. Do you guys want to just introduce yourselves briefly?
Hi, so I'm Royston. I'm head of sales and client services. Normally we would be office-based. That's not happening at the minute, as you can probably understand. And I support the team to look after the JGA account amongst other coaching, assessment, support accounts.
Yes. So just a brief bit of background about Genius Within. So we are a neurodiversity specialist company. I started the company 10 years ago. I'm a psychologist, I'm an occupational psychologist, and this has been a specialist field of mine for about 20 years. I've worked with people who are long-term unemployed, and we do that at Genius Within. We also work in prisons, and we support people who are in employment to maintain that employment and to be more productive at work. So neurodiversity is something I'm going to go into the details of. It's really quite hard to judge what your existing experience is and how much you already know and don't know. And so what I'm going to do is encourage you to join in the conversation and to keep this quite discursive so that I can kind of feed off where you're at and go down any tangents that are more relevant to you and not relevant to you. I've got some sort of standard material. And so if I'm going too fast or too slow, please feel free to interrupt me with the chat. And I am getting to the point where I can almost present and keep control of the chat at the same time. I can't always answer it, but I can read it and talk at the same time. So we are learning in this period of our lives, are we not? So if anybody has any questions before we start, please feel free to say so. Richard Goodwin, you can interrupt me now. Were you testing? Was that a test?
I was not testing. I was going to stage an intervention.
Yes.
And just give you a little bit of an overview as to who we are as well. The 30-second version as opposed to the 3-hour version that I'm liable to run into if it got stopped. So we've been around for everyone on the call pretty much, maybe apart from you knows, for just under 30 years. It was started by my mum, who was Jane Goodwin, hence JGA, Jane Goodwin Associates.
Okay.
I've been working here for, 6-ish years, something like that. And in our current iteration, because we've had to reinvent ourselves entirely over the last couple of years, we have 180 apprentices on programme, although for those who don't know, we were yesterday awarded a contract for up to 60 policy officers from the Department of Health and Social Care, so it'll soon be a lot more than 180. On apprenticeship programs, we have around a couple of hundred learners a year on diplomas, so that's childcare, adult care, and business at the moment. And we have several hundred people of the year that flow through our programs that Kelly, who I saw earlier somewhere, is running around spectator safety, and some of the lower level mental health and preparing to work in adult care and that kind of stuff. So that's our range of things. We also have an endpoint assessment organisation with the massive workforce of one that is focused on niches again, but around endpoint assessment. You'll find niche is a relatively common theme running around what we tend to do in the last couple of years. We've been working with Genius Within for, I'm going to guess 3 or 4 years now. As always with these things, you start off with big plans and the reality starts off very small. But several of even our current workforce actually, who have been on apprenticeships in that time have benefited. And I know Jabril, for example, is a huge advocate for Genius Within. And as we've grown our direct apprenticeship provision from known as next to bugger all a few years ago to the 180 now, we've gradually grown the use of Genius Within and other additional learning support as well. One of our challenges is to make sure that non-apprenticeship learners also take advantage of the various options for mental health support as well. So that's us in a nutshell.
obviously, Richard, you have invited Genius Within to do this lunch and learn. So if this was to go really well for you, what would you want your team and your colleagues to get out of it?
Oh, I'd like everyone to have an overview of what mental health means, what the options are for helping people.
So neurodiversity and mental health are not the same thing.
Neurodiversity, since you're in a neurodiversity company. How to identify it and what to do if we do, essentially,
Okay.
and what the options are thereafter.
That seems perfectly feasible. My remit today very much is to explain to you what neurodiversity is. And in that, I will also be explaining how it is different from mental health. So I'm going to start presenting. I'm going to do the share screen thing. In the category of neurodiversity, we have applied neurodiversity, which relates to dyslexia, DCD, which stands for developmental coordination disorder, otherwise known as dyspraxia, dyscalculia and dysgraphia, and these all mean problems with. So dys is Latin for problem with, lexia is Latin for words, dyspraxia is difficulties with movement, dyscalculia is difficulties with numbers, and dysgraphia is difficulties with writing. So these are all conditions that you're born with. Usually you can acquire them via certain head injuries. They relate to applied educational skills such as reading or motor control. They are not considered a health condition, but they are typically protected by the Equality Act. So people with those conditions do tend to qualify for Equality Act protection. We also have clinical neurodiversity, which tends to incorporate Tourette syndrome, autism and ADHD. Again, these are things that you're born with. They may develop as you get older, so you wouldn't necessarily be born with tics, but it's not considered something that you acquire via an injury or an illness. It's something that develops as your brain matures. It relates to behavioural skills. These are considered health conditions, and we could expand this group to include intellectual difficulties as part of a kind of broad spectrum of human experience as well. And again, these conditions qualify for Equality Act protection most of the time. We also have the idea of acquired neurodiversity. So this is something that you're not born with, but you acquire it through your life. And that might be mental health, as I said before, or it could be a neurological illness or a brain injury. And these conditions, everything that I'm calling neurodiversity, has something in common. I'm just going to flick to this side. Can you see my spiky slide? Okay, so what all neurodiversity conditions have in common is this idea of a spiky profile. So usually when psychologists are measuring somebody's capabilities or their cognitive abilities, what we do is we measure lots of different types. There's not one thing that we call intelligence. There's lots of different types of intelligence. It might be intelligence for kind of abstract thinking and putting ideas together. It might be intelligence for explaining how things work. It might be intelligence for listening to and picking up detail. It might be intelligence for processing information at very quick speeds. And when we add all those things together, we have something that we call IQ, but actually IQ is made up of lots and lots of different things. And so what you'll see on your screen is two graphs overlaid on top of each other, and the purple spikes are where there are big differences between elements that an individual is doing well and elements that they're struggling with, and that's called a spiky profile. And then the green dots, there's not much difference. They're all much of a muchness. So the person with the green scores is neurotypical. This means they do not have a neurodiverse condition, and actually around 2/3 of the human population are neurotypical. They will score much of a muchness, maybe 95. So if 100 is the average, they might score 95, 103, 102, 104. They'll have some strengths and weaknesses, but it's much of a muchness. Whereas somebody with a neurodiverse condition such as dyslexia or autism is going to have big spikes in their profile. So they're going to have things that they do really, really well and things that they really, really struggle with. And so what we've started doing is calling this specialist rather than generalist thinkers. And so the idea behind the neurodiversity movement is that it's not necessarily that you are broken if you have these big spikes, it's just that you are unusual. And so if you're having a mental health need, if you're having an episode of depression or anxiety, you will have a big cost to certain parts of your thinking, like your concentration, how quickly you process things. So during the episode of a mental ill health, you will have a spiky profile because your verbal skills won't be affected, but your attention might be. So you might become spiky, and then you might go back to normal. If you have a head injury, you might lose one or two of the functions, but the rest of it stays where it was. And so you become in this spiky profile. Whereas if you have autism or dyslexia or dyspraxia, you are born with a spiky profile. So the spiky profile is really the defining characteristic of neurodiverse conditions. And we'll talk about the implications of that in a minute, because obviously it makes a big difference. If you have a spiky profile and you're going through a school system where everybody wants you to be average in everything, it's not going to work. And if you have a spiky profile and the things that you're brilliant at are the things that the schools don't really care about, you're going to come out of that school system not realizing that you have any value in the workplace. And that is the clients that we find ourselves dealing with time and time again. And I can see a couple of people nodding, and I think you're kind of recognizing this experience. So thinking about the spiky profile and how there's a big difference between what people are good at and what people are struggling with, I want to take you back to these conditions and their names. So if we think about dyslexia, attention deficit, autistic spectrum disorder, what we're doing with all of these labels that we've got at the moment is putting all our attention on the troughs of the spiky profile and none of our attention on the peaks of the spiky profile. So we're kind of defining people by what they struggle with rather than defining them with what they could excel at. And one of the things that Genius Within has been doing for the past 10 years is really working on rebranding these conditions around what they're good at. Not because it's a Pollyanna concept and people with dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD are all geniuses within, but just because actually we need to pay attention, we need to do a correction so that we can come back somewhere in the middle, which is there is a genuine picture of strength here as well as these struggles, and we need to give people the opportunity to experience both of those circumstances and feel able to be at their best as well as what they struggle with. So looking at the research-based evidence around strengths, which is thin because most of the research is aimed at finding the bits that are broken so that we can fix them, because that's the kind of dominant research paradigm that we live in, and education paradigm. But looking at the strengths that are associated with conditions, and I'll just read what's here for you now. So dyscalculia is associated with verbal skills and innovative thinking. Dyslexia is associated with visual thinking and creativity and 3D mechanical skills. ADHD is associated with creativity, hyperfocus, energy and passion. Tourette syndrome tends to come with acute observational skills and developing the ability to have great cognitive control around what they're thinking, and also creativity. Autistic spectrum condition is associated with concentration and fine detail processing and enhanced long-term memory. And I won't go on, but you get the point. So we do have enough evidence that these conditions can bring talents as well as struggles. So one of the points is that the peak of a neurodiverse spiky profile can be well above the spike of a non-neurodiverse profile. That is indeed one of the points. It is, because we do have people who have a neurotypical profile that is all above average. We do have that. So those are people who are all above average, and those people are very clever and they are geniuses and they are very lucky. La la la. On off they go and be very genius and very lucky somewhere. But we don't have very many people like that. We have about 1% of the population where everything is really, really high. And then we have the majority of the population in that neurotypical band. And then for the neurodivergent, there's lots of language going around, and we can have a conversation about language if you want, but it's an emerging field in terms of language, so there is no definitive right way to do it. If you're working with an individual, ask them how they like to be referred to. But a neurodivergent brain will have a big disparity between peaks and troughs, and the majority of neurodivergent people will have at least one thing that is in the high average or above average range. there's actually a limit for psychologists on making a diagnosis of neurodiversity if people don't have anything that's at least in the average band or slightly above average. If the IQ is below a certain point overall, we're not allowed to make a diagnosis of neurodiversity. We make a diagnosis of general learning disabilities, which is different. So in order for people to have a label like dyslexia or dyspraxia, it means that they have got some skills and some talents. And certainly in my early days of developing this work, one of the things I used to do the most of is talking to people about what they do well. You might have seen I made some documentaries with the BBC a few years ago called Employable Me, and that was the job of Employable Me. It was about my work where you go and you do the diagnostic process and just talk about what people are doing well and what that could look like in a workplace. So bearing this in mind, I'm not going to go there. So now let's look at the Equality Act. So and let's look at functional day-to-day difficulties, because what the neurominority conditions that we tend to think of most is kind of autism, ADHD, dyslexia and dyspraxia. So those tend to be the main four that we come across in our day-to-day work in apprenticeships and with learners. And how that spiky profile turns into difficulties tends to be like this. And what's really interesting is it doesn't tend to matter what label people have. These tend to be the problems. So what's on the screen is that 92% of people that we work with tend to have memory and concentration difficulties. 83% tend to have organisational skills difficulties, 78% with time management, and 67% with communication, and actually 67% with stress management as well. That tends to be the thing that they come for help. And as you may or may not know, the legal definition of Equality Act protection is that a person has a disability if she or he has a mental or physical impairment that has substantial and long-term adverse effect on his or her ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So those things that I've just mentioned around memory, time, organisation and communication, those are considered normal day-to-day activities, and those are where we need to focus our attention. So when I do awareness training, often people want me to talk to them about the brain. They want me to explain what part of the brain is affected by dyslexia or ADHD. They want me to talk about neurotransmitters. And I don't think any of that is relevant, if I'm honest. And I would ask you to consider, if you were having an awareness training on sensory impairment, like sight loss or being deaf, would we be talking about the optic nerve and cochlear implants, or would we be talking about how you as a professional working with individuals need to adjust in order to accommodate that person? And we would have all our attention on the accommodation, and that's what I think we need to do with neurodiversity as well. And I think that sometimes the reason I get asked about brains is because people still don't really believe it's a thing. So it's kind of like, well, prove to me that it's a thing, and then I will make the adjustments that I need to make. But what I'm trying to say to you is, I don't need to prove to you that it's a thing, because the Equality Act has already done that. So because we have these consistent and persistent difficulties in normal day-to-day activities, there is no need to question whether it's a thing. We have oodles of case law around dyslexia, autism, ADHD. We know it's a thing. We have to make accommodations and adjustments. And there's actually no need to question people's diagnoses, because if we've got evidence that that individual is struggling with memory, organisation, time management and communication, which includes literacy, if they're struggling with that for 12 months or more, we are required to make those adjustments, because it's the effect. So what I've written here is there's no need for a diagnosis. It is the effect, not the cause of the impairment, that matters. Employers are required to make reasonable adjustments to enable employees to meet their potential. So that's the kind of legal situation that we're in. And I just want to go right now, I'm going to go all the way down, sorry. Actually, I'm going to go right there. So the way this affects our client group is 28% of long-term unemployed people are dyslexic. And the population prevalence in the general population is 10%. So it's very overrepresented with unemployment. Only 10 to 15% of autistic people have a job, and autism is prevalent in the population at 1%. So we're overrepresented again with autism. ADHD is prevalent in the population at 3%, but 25% of prisoners have ADHD. So we have a picture of exclusion for neurominorities that is quite endemic and has been going on for a long time. And this is where I think it starts. All the way here. I think it starts here. So I expect some of you have seen this cartoon before. It's a picture of a bird, a monkey, a penguin, an elephant, a fish, a seal, and a dog sitting in front of a teacher who is saying, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And as you can tell, some of those animals are going to nail that particular exam, and some of those animals are going to fail that exam. So the questions that I want to ask you really are, why make everybody go through the same system if they're good at different things? Adapt your processes to allow for individual strengths, and think about the end result. Don't focus only on the process. So what we've essentially got with neurodiversity, if we think about the human species, is we've got specialists and we've got generalists, but we've got an education system that rewards generalists, not specialists. How many people do you have who are absolutely brilliant at their job but can't do exams? They're not good at spelling, they're not good at literacy, they might be failing the numeracy components, but can they, are they fantastic plumbers? Yes, they are. Are they fantastic at technology? Yes, they are. Are they great hairdressers? Yes, they are. Whatever their skill is, they're really good at it, but they can't necessarily pass exams. And one of the reasons I think this is a big problem is because the exams aren't necessarily going to predict whether someone is going to be good at that job. And so we're creating barriers and exclusions that we don't need to do, and we're wasting human potential by having a very exclusive education system. I have got some good friends in the Microsoft accessibility team, and they are convinced that literacy is going to be an obsolete skill within the next 5 years because of the way we use technology now. So because of what they say is it's already an obsolete skill in terms of what we need, but because it isn't widespread enough yet, we're still needing people to develop skills of literacy. But most of us have got one of these, and it's a device that will let us speak into a microphone, and it will turn that speech into text. It will we can highlight text within it, and it will read that text out at us. Lots of people have got technology on their phone now where you can point it at anything and it will read what you're pointing it at. And most Microsoft programs now have got embedded spell checkers that are dyslexia compliant and will basically remove the need for spelling. So I understand this is quite a controversial point, but we might find ourselves in the situation where dyslexia doesn't really exist in 20 years' time because nobody needs to learn to spell or read visually in the same way. And so in which case, what is it that people will be doing instead, and which kinds of specialist thinking might be a disability in 20 years' time if dyslexia isn't? This could be changed around. And what we're really talking about is the social model of disability. So the social model of disability says that people are disabled by the environment in which they are living and not by their integral biology. So there's nothing inherently disabling necessarily about being a spiky profile thinker. The only time that it's disabling to be a spiky profile thinker is when you're living in a world that relies on the things that you can't do. But in a normal human environment, in the environment that we evolved to be part of, it would be normal to have specialists and generalists. It would be normal to have a couple of people in the tribe that were a bit rubbish at chatting, but really, really good at focusing intently on small details and making things for the rest of the tribe to use. It would be normal to have people who were really good at bridge building, but really pants at kind of doing the same thing over and over each day. So, you know, the idea of specialists and generalists within human species is quite normal. And what we've got is a bunch of education systems and workplaces that really prioritize some skills over the others. Yes, global listening. I like that phrase as well, Biddy. So the thing that we've got is we are totally dependent on literacy, numeracy, sitting still and concentrating, and concentrating in busy environments where you are required to make eye contact. And if you can't do those things, then you tend to get labelled with one of those conditions that I've mentioned. If you're quite intelligent overall, or you've got quite good resources overall, you might cope really well. You might mask those difficulties that you're having. You might end up very stressed, and you might end up having a mental health breakdown. If you have had those abilities in the past and then you have an accident, or you have something like multiple sclerosis where some of those abilities start to fade and you end up with a spiky profile, you might find that you can't do the things that you used to do, and that would be quite jarring for you. But what we have to remember is that it's our society that's odd, not the individual in the neurodiversity world. It is weird that we rely on 12 years of education where you have to sit down in a large busy group and write all day and concentrate on 2D sequential subjects. It has no basis in our evolution of how we are. Actually, and it also has no basis in the world of work. So in the world of work, we train surgeons by looking at how well they can sit still and write for 16 years before we test their fine motor control and their reaction times in an operating theatre. We train bricklayers by getting them to sit down for 12 years and write things before we let them make 3D things come together and build stuff. We train, you know, we're doing very odd training. So I think I've said enough, and I think I've put that thought in your head. And what I'd like to do now is stop sharing my slides and get your thoughts about that from your position as apprenticeship support providers. I think a lot of the clients that you work with will come into that category of having practical life skills at a very high level of intelligence, but having not necessarily succeeded within the school system. And so therefore they are not aware of how clever they are in their chosen trade or vocation, and they're also still struggling to get through the apprenticeship system, which is still a little bit too dependent on reading and writing, given the jobs that it's trying to prepare people for. What do you think? And I can wait for a really long time, just saying.
Big silence. Shall I go first?
Yeah.
I think that we shouldn't make assumptions. Like we shouldn't make assumptions about what neurodiversity is. We shouldn't make assumptions about what apprenticeships are. And because people are on one of our apprenticeships, it doesn't actually necessarily mean that they've had a bad time at school or whatever.
Some of the stuff we do very good point.
Is truly specialist, and you just don't get their education elsewhere. So policy officer, bid and proposal coordination, you know, you don't do it at school, you don't do it at college, you don't do it at university, for example, generally speaking. So so we can't necessarily make that thing. We do have people on property maintenance, but generally speaking, it's officey, telephony type roles in relatively specialist niches. Having said that, if you look at something like spectator safety, for example, that Kelly, who hopefully is listening, she's on mute at the moment, leads, then that is level 2. It is training people in crowd management and stewarding at stadia and for big events. And clearly, not clearly, but I would bet my bottom dollar that in that world, there's a large proportion of people who have struggled in education one way or another. And we do, you know, business admin and other things where people are.
And also, not all neurodiverse people struggle in school. So I have a PhD. I didn't have to repeat anything at school. I got great grades at GCSEs. I didn't ever go to school because I hated it, but I still got really good grades. So yeah, sometimes, so not all neurodiverse people are struggling in school. That is actually another stereotype we should probably undermine. So some of your some of your non-strugglers can still be neurodiverse, which begs the question, what would you notice if somebody was in a neuro minority and might need Equality Act specific support? And I think the thing that you would notice the most is inconsistency. So what you would notice is that some things they are doing brilliantly and some things they are not. Some days they are doing brilliantly and some days they are not. So inconsistent performance is a bit of a giveaway. I once did an assessment for somebody who was in the top 3% of the population for his verbal and the bottom 7% of the population for how quickly he could process information. So he could talk and understand ideas and concepts, but he couldn't read very fast. And he was failing his MA. And what he said to me is, he said, I feel like I've got a Ferrari engine in a Morris Minor. And I might have just aged him and myself with that metaphor, because I'm not sure that everyone knows what a Morris Minor is.
I was thinking how young you were, having done GCSEs, frankly, so I wouldn't apologise for your age.
Only just, but I'm in there. And
I was last year at O-levels.
Yes, I shall repeat it as often as possible for that very reason. But yeah, so he, a Ferrari engine in a Morris Minor, which is, he used to say, sometimes I can just go really fast and I feel like I'm nailing everything. And then other times I kind of turn the corner and the wheels fall off and I don't know what's going on. And so I think, working with individuals in whatever, and it's a really good point that you made, Richard, but in any of the apprenticeships and with any of the histories, what you're going to notice is that inconsistency.
A good person to start with might actually be Steve, because Steve has a range of learners from a range of companies, and there's quite a lot of them, so he gets to see a sample of people all doing very similar roles. What do you see, Steve? Do you see this kind of world impacting on sales? Sales as in sales executives, for those who don't know.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you get people who excel in a sales environment, especially if it's a face-to-face sales environment, that then really struggle in other areas. And sometimes it's neurodiversity, sometimes it's just application, sometimes it's just the learning preferences. They just don't want to do that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But one of the things we do with the sales team, which really helps in terms of the spiky profile and the specialist and generalist, which is terminology I really like actually, is getting to look at things like social styles, because people are very aware that different people tend to communicate in different ways, and it's something we need to teach people to understand as salespeople. And then we talk to them about, if you've got a social style, that means you're naturally good in certain situations, but you might not be so good in others. And then we use that to translate across to get them to help to understand neurodiversity. So yeah, it's actually easy from a sales perspective to get people thinking about things in a different way, because they're always thinking about how best to communicate with people, and of course everyone's different in that. It does give me a question actually, and it's to do with terminology. So sometimes when we're talking about diversity, people will use the word abnormal, and then at that which point I get the flip chart out and I draw the normal distribution.
Yep.
What do you replace that word with? I like specialists and generalists, but you say you're not abnormal, you're just different.
People like different phrases. So some people like to say I'm neurodiverse, and other people will say you can't be neurodiverse because neurodiverse works at the species level, so you as an individual can't be diverse. So that's just a bit of a linguistic rabbit hole that we could spend hours in, and I can tell you that some people on social media do spend hours on that exact subject. We can also say neurominority, because statistically you are a minority, because the majority, if we look at the normal distribution, the majority, the biggest cohort is people who are average in all things. And we can say neurodivergent. And some people simply really like to be called by the thing that they've been diagnosed by, which is autistic or dyslexic. But the other thing to point out is that not everybody has a diagnosis. And one of the things that we found out recently is that diagnosis is really subject to exclusion in and of itself, and it has there's gender bias and race bias. So if you are a female, if you're a black female or an Asian female, you are less likely to be diagnosed with autism than a white man by a considerable amount. And it's one of the issues that we have in the field at the moment, is that people have started to see neurodiversity as synonymous with autism. And they've started to see neurodiversity and think only of autistic people working in technology. And actually, that's a really kind of discriminatory, gender-bound issue, because technology tends to encourage white men anyway. And then it people who haven't been diagnosed with autism, who might really be good at technology, can't get in because they haven't got the free pass to get into that particular club to be, the autistic neurodiverse cool person in the tech team. But also, not all autistic people like technology. Some autistic people are really good at language, hence why they spend hours in rabbit holes on social media as to what terminology is the best one. Some of them really like art. So there's different, we've got too stereotypical in that sort of respect, and a lot of the people that you're working with won't have a diagnosis because it wasn't part of the, you have to pay to be diagnosed with dyslexia and dyspraxia. You can't get it diagnosed on the National Health Service once you're an adult, and the school systems have been reducing the number of people that they diagnose systematically over the last 20 years, because every time they diagnose somebody, they then have to spend money on adjustments. So it's been a local authority policy across the whole of the UK to reduce diagnosis. If you needed an ADHD diagnosis and you're female and you're my age, you won't have one because it wasn't an available condition for girls in the 90s and 80s. So, there's lots of things that we have to remember around neurodiversity, which is why I'm encouraging you to look at the normal functions in the day-to-day rather than expect people to come with a nice diagnosis saying, I know I have this and this is what I need. They're not going to. If you see somebody who is consistently struggling with the same pattern of behaviour or application over a 12-month period or more, you are better off assuming that they have a reason for that and providing the support rather than assuming that it's motivational or that it's an attitude issue.
As you said earlier, that you're only neurodiverse if you've got that spiky profile.
And we can measure that, and we can do that, and that's what we do in a diagnostic. We measure that spiky profile and we say, yes, you tick that box, or no, you don't. But because that process costs money, not everybody has done it, and not everybody has had access to it within that. Do you know the waiting list for an adult ADHD diagnosis is about 7 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
So so if you're only neurodiverse if you've got a spiky profile, is it fair to say that if you're neurodiverse, you are always a specialist? Is that a better? So in terms of thinking about portraying it to my learners, I'd kind of say that that's the thing again, to focus on that positive. You are a specialist. Okay.
You're a specialist, and when the worlds align beautifully, that specialism is the thing that you're training for. If your specialism is verbal skills and kind of linguistic accuracy and writing, then absolutely the kind of policy stuff is what you would go into. If your specialist skill is creativity and putting things together and thinking on your feet, then you're more likely to end up in the sales field. So that spiky profile will exist if you have a neurominority condition. But what I'm saying is there are lots of people with that spiky profile that simply haven't been diagnosed because it's something that tends to happen when people are well resourced as opposed to being per need. And what we're finding out now is that lots of people that have mental health diagnoses are actually undiagnosed autistic or undiagnosed ADHD. But, I wasn't diagnosed until I was 38, which is ridiculous given that this is my specialism, because ADHD wasn't an available condition for girls when I was at school.
So my takeaway from that is, if you're neurodiverse, you're a specialist. Whereas if you're what society would label a genius, you're just a high-functioning generalist.
Yes, a genius is a high-functioning generalist, But lots of people that we know to be genius actually, are quite likely to have a spiky profile. It's just that they've applied their niche, they're in their niche. So, people with ADHD are twice as likely to start businesses when they leave education than neurotypicals. There's lots of very famous neurodiverse entrepreneurs out there, Richard Branson being one, the guy who, I can't remember all their names now. See, I've got it. But there's a bunch of really high profile CEO neurodivergents. People like, lots of actors with autism. Harry Potter, Daniel Radcliffe is dyspraxic. Florence and the Machine is dyspraxic. People with dyspraxia tend to have verbal skills, so you can see where that's going. There's lots of Simone Biles gymnast has ADHD. Michael Phelps has ADHD. A lot of high-profile sports people have ADHD. So you know, there's what we in the world refer to as geniuses don't have to be high-functioning neurotypicals. They can be specialist spiky profilers who just found their niche and nailed it. Any other thoughts or comments? I've heard lots from Steve and quite a bit from Richard. Who else has something that they'd like to ask or comment on?
Hi.
Hi,
I think
Ashley.
I'm dyslexic. I think the older I've got, I'd say I found the things I'm good at compared to the things I'm bad at, because I've had to improve those to get by.
Mm-hmm.
I think one element, my partner Halima, she probably notices more than ever. I get complained at all the time about it. It's my short-term memory.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
an element of, I know I've got it, and sometimes I have to kind of apologise for it, because I know I'm sitting there I'm trying to think of a word,
Mm-hmm.
and it's in the back of my. It's like a blurred vision, like a glass plate, where I can know what I want to say, but I can't see it.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, the elements where you were talking about, like the education side. Secondary schools, I'll be honest, I felt I wasted 5 years at secondary school. I really did. I've got an identical twin brother who's actually worse dyslexia than what I've got. I mean, you don't really notice it with me so much, but my twin. But we're both, I mean, now I'm a teacher, but for 18 years before, I was an entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very natural to me,
Mm-hmm.
where, I mean, I do notice in some of our students, and there's a gentleman here, Ian Pickles, who I worked with quite close in the past, and we still work together. We've noticed students who are dyslexic, and part of it, the schools have never noticed it, but I've noticed it.
Yeah, and if people have got enough either support in their family life or good teaching, or if they've got enough high profile spikes to carry them through, they will get through the school system, certainly the early school system and secondary up to secondary education, without needing any support. So, you know, that what we find a lot is that people start to kind of hit barriers later in life. A lot of our client referrals are people who didn't really, for diagnosis, a lot of our referrals are people who didn't start struggling until they got to university, or until they got to a management role, or, you know, until they hit a certain point where the things that they do well couldn't drag them along anymore, and they were just sort of hitting barriers with the things that they struggle with. So I just want to flip back to the slides, because I just want to end with, what does a reasonable adjustment look like for this cohort? Because we know if we're dealing with people with physical mobility issues, we know we need to widen access in walkways and put ramps in and make sure that toilets are accessible. But how do you make an adjustment for something that is cognitive? How do you make an adjustment for something that is around memory or thinking or those things? So I'm just going to go back to the screen share. So one of the things that I did in my PhD was I looked at the different adjustments that are in place for different people. And what we've got here is the most common categories of adjustment. So there's 8 categories. Executive functions coaching. And by executive functions, I mean memory, concentration, time management, and all of those things that neurodivergent people have in common. Coaching around literacy, and that doesn't tend to be teaching people to read and write, because if 12 years of education failed, then it probably is still going to fail. So we tend to do literacy coaching around how to accommodate literacy weaknesses, so techniques like speed reading or applying assistive technology, or how to structure written work. It tends to be at that level. Assistive technology is a category of its own. So that's the sort of software where you can speak into a microphone and it will type for you. It might be mind mapping software that helps you structure your thoughts before it turns it into a written document, that sort of thing. Workstation adaptations, which would be people having dual screens like I like to have, that I haven't got because I put it on and all of a sudden all my slides didn't work if I turn it off. But yeah, dual screens, so that you've got more visually in front of you and you don't have to rely on your memory to think what else is where. I also have a standing desk, which Access to Work paid for, because I like to move more than most people. And those are the kind of formal things that you tend to buy in for people that tend to be you know, either funded by Access to Work. These things can be funded by learner support money through apprenticeships. And these tend to be, you know, I call them formal adjustments because you kind of have to bring them in specifically. And then on the other side, you've got less formal adjustments, informal adjustments, which is being flexible around schedules. So that might be allowing people, if you're an employer, it might be allowing people to do flexi time and to come in at different times of day. Adjustments to the way you do your supervisor input. So that might be more specific feedback based on behavior rather than interpretation, which is really essential for autistic people and ADHD. It might be adjustments in the way that you deliver formal training. So you might be doing things like sending people out the reading materials in advance. You might actually send them on some formal training specifically that as part of an adjustment. And environmental flexibility, which is very much about thinking where people are. People with concentration difficulties tend to really struggle in noisy environments. So the more background distraction you have, the harder it is to focus. And that's true for everybody. But if you have a low baseline of how easy it is for you to focus in the first place, you add in a busy open plan office or a busy site, and it kind of disappears. So something that happens a lot is we allow people to wear noise cancelling headphones, or to book out a meeting, or we arrange it around a schedule, and people know that they can work from home on a Tuesday in order to get a report done. And it's really funny, actually. So this is something that I've for 20 years I've had pushback on this from employers. 20 years I've had pushback on people being able to work remotely as a reasonable adjustment, and everyone's going, oh no, it's not reasonable, no, it's not reasonable, it's not possible, it's not reasonable, no one could do it. We have just had a giant worldwide experiment that shows how possible it is, and I am waiting for the first employer to disagree with me on this one coming forward. It's going to be great fun. Oh really? What is your evidence that this person cannot work remotely? Can we have some evidence? Don't think we've got any, have we? So the interesting thing about these is the level of popularity. So one of my studies was kind of going, well, how popular are they and do they work? And the most popular was executive functions coaching and environmental flexibility. So allowing people to change the environment in which they work and getting them support for that memory were the two most popular adjustments, and the least popular was assistive technology, mainly because people don't know how to use it and it requires specific training on how to use it. And then looking at success rates of coaching specifically, we tend to get a 75% improvement in performance when the clients rate their distance traveled, and the managers tend to rate 47% improvement. But that's because they start from different places. So when we're getting our clients and their managers to rate current performance before we start coaching, they tend to rate differently. So managers will give them on average 5 out of 10, and clients will give themselves on average 4 out of 10. So they're starting from a kind of lower basis of confidence. And then by the end of the coaching, they all tend to be on average a 7 out of 10. So the employees or clients get a bigger distance traveled, but that's because the managers are giving them a higher rating to start with, either because the employee is lacking in confidence or because the manager isn't quite aware of how hard that individual is working underneath to get things going. And then a year later, following adjustments, we've got a 95% job retention rate and a 25% promotion rate. So, you know, making adjustments works for this cohort, and it's very successful. And we think that we can also do much more in terms of making the adjustments kind of be more systematic and easy to access, having kind of groups of people all doing memory exercises at the same time rather than one-to-one. And that's something that we can certainly explore with you guys. So we're just at the end of our 1 hour, and I don't want to keep you over time, but I am available for more questions if you want to ask more questions on adjustments specifically. Let me see, there's a few things come up in the chat. Oh good, just information sharing, all good.